kind of a spooky night here in the warehouse, but it's the perfect opportunity to tell you something. Come closer, because this is going to be a little frightening for some and unbelievable for many others. Come on. Ready? Someday in the future, the U.S. Army combat uniform, even those in the universal camouflage pattern, are gonna be sought after. Pretty terrifying, right? Now, it's not like this will happen overnight or even in a few months or even years. It could honestly be decades from now, but eventually it will happen, and like those scrutinizing the variants and versions of World War II or even Cold War uniforms, it's gonna be the same for global war on terror pieces of the early 21st century. Hell, it's already sort of begun with 80s and Gulf War gear. Now, you may be thinking, well, there's just UCP, OEF-CP, and OCP, along with the occasional experimental piece like UCP Delta or those test AB pieces with the funny popping snap buttons. Well, that is sort of true, but there's actually quite a bit in between which relate not only to camouflage and color, but also the fabric, button versus hook and loop, collar types, IR tab locations, among others. But don't fret, we're ahead of the curve here, and as such are going to do something of a breakdown of all the primary iterations of them, which will also sort of paint a picture of their history and evolution. So to kick things off, I'm going to do a cool hand gesture to signify a transition into the sponsor of this video, Venture Surplus. Specializing in United States-based surplus and gear, Venture is your one-stop shop, especially when it comes to Army combat uniforms. In fact, many of the ones you'll see throughout this video were supplied by them. For a while now, they've taken that little extra step to differentiate the versions, not only by color, camouflage, and company, but also by the little nuanced features like hook and loop versus BDU buttons. So if you're looking to round out your ACUs or get a jump on them before others, be sure to take a look at their inventory. And while there, remember, we've got the coupon code HISTORY10 to get 10% off of your order. Now, let's get back to it with a quick recap. The ACU, or Army Combat Uniform, was first announced in 2003 and was the final iteration of a series of tests the Army had conducted when trying to design its next-gen uniform, which would replace their BDU, or battle dress uniform. In a way, tethered to the camouflage field tests of the early 2000s, these began to be issued to soldiers in 2004 with what was touted as a state-of-the-art camouflage design, UCP, or Universal Camouflage Pattern, which was supposed to conceal wearers into just about any terrain. Needless to say, that didn't quite work out, leading to a little controversy and negativity. However, the uniform cut of the ACU was received a little more positively. Now, very early uniforms were sort of all over the place with things like hook and loop material colors, tags being a bit different in size, shape, and color, as well as nomenclature and terms seen on them. Over time, though, these would sort of stabilize, though things like tags between contractors and minor differences in certain features continued, but to get things moving, the uniforms officially are designated and differentiated by three things, at least currently. Types, which refer to the fabric composition, styles meaning the cut, i.e. unisex and female, and classes, which relate to specialty treatments of the fabric. But it goes a bit more than that, as the uniforms themselves have been both subtly and greatly altered over the years, with no real official designations or naming conventions beyond the just mentioned being employed to differentiate them, so we'll use the terms generation and variants to identify them throughout this video. So for example, the first one we'll be looking at will be Generation 1, Variant A, which will also serve as a baseline in features going forward, so let's get to it. Starting with the top, which were officially referred to as coats, they featured a fabric content that was 50/50 nylon cotton ripstop, which the trousers were also made of, obviously, a zippered front that had a nylon pull with a hook and loop secured cover flap that also included a single square for attaching a rank patch, a Mandarin-style collar terminating on either side with curved corners that also featured a single securing flap, which was mostly flattened and worn open, only to be closed when wearing things like body armor and vests, unless you're a soldier in nearly every Hollywood movie ever. Two inwardly angled chest pockets secured by hook and loop, two strips above them to attach name and branch tapes, two hook and loop secured shoulder pockets, which also had more hook and loop material on top of them for insignia and other patches, and an FR friend or foe glint square that was sewn to the upper pocket flap that was covered by a nylon band when not needed, reinforcement areas by the elbows which had a hook and loop secured opening on their top so wearers could insert foam pads for extra protection, hook and loop adjusted sleeve cuffs, a 3-slot pen pocket on the wearer's left sleeve, and a bi-swing back that is sort of a pleated area that rises away slightly starting at the shoulders and ended below the armpit area, which allowed for greater mobility, comfort, and less stress on the uniform when wearing additional gear. The curved collars appeared to be short-lived and looked to be holdovers from the experimental close combat uniform that were field tested before the adoption of the ACUs, as they had a few of the same elements as the finalized uniform. Link to our video on that can be found at the end. But to add to this, there were even a few examples of early ACU coats featuring collar tags that say Coat Combat Uniform CU, which is what the modified CCUs have. And while on the topic of tags and early contract ACUs, ACUs, some bear dates that even predate the uniform, such as this one dated 2002, that also states the fabric is wind-resistant poplin, so there's a bit of fun when it comes to the very early items. Anyway though, very quickly these curved collars would be done away with and replaced with squared-off ones, likely allowing for easier grabbing and adjusting. Moving to the trousers, they saw a 4-button fly, a waist that included both belt loops that would range in size between 0.375 and 0.5 inches, or about 0.95 to 1.27 centimeters wide by 2 to 2.5 inches, or 5.08 to 6.35 centimeters in length, and an internal drawstring for size adjustments. 2 inset waist pockets, 2 billowed thigh cargo pockets which were secured by hook and loop material and could be secured a bit more by way of an internal elastic cord and barrel pinch adjuster, 2 lower leg cargo pockets which were also secured by 3 pieces of hook and loop material, reinforced knees that, like the elbow areas, included an opening, this time on the lower portion, which allowed for the inserting of foam padding, drawstrings on the legs, a reinforced seat area on the back, and 2 inset rear pockets, both of which were secured by way of 2 BDU style buttons each. Beginning fielding in 2004, as the war on terror was already underway, seeing both OEF and OIF ongoing, it wasn't long until the threat of burns became a huge issue due to the increased usage of improvised explosive devices. Starting in 2006, a number of ONSs, or operational need statements, were being received from the Army stating how the new ACUs and their 50/50 NYCO blend fabric was essentially useless against explosions and fires, leading to an influx in burn injuries, especially with those on patrol or performing convoy duties. A stopgap action was seen by sending over already stocked Nomex combat vehicle crewmen's uniforms for those mostly at risk, while the program executive officer of the U.S. Army began work on a more permanent solution. This came essentially in the form of using the already established ACU design, but changing out the fabric for a more protective flame-resistant one. Through 2006, a number of fabric compositions were tested, seeing a few experimental and limited-produced trial pieces such as these two, which upon initial inspection don't really see anything all that different about them. However, when looking closer up at their fabric, you can see how it's vastly different from the 50/50 NYCO and even the finalized FR fabric, which we'll get to in just a little. These two were 40% aramid, 29% cotton, 28% nylon, 3% other, and 100% aramid Gen 2. You can just tell from the fabric alone they lack ripstop capabilities, appear softer and almost plusher, and color-wise are a little different than the standard. These compositions were obviously not chosen, and the reason likely was multifaceted, with factors such as comfort, heat retention, breathability, and durability overall. But what did end up happening was one fabric type ultimately proved to be the overall winner. Tencat brand's Defender M, made of 65% rayon, 25% para-aramid, and 10% nylon, the same material used for the Marine Corps' flame-resistant organized gear system, or FROG for short. Being already proven in testing and initial fielding in 2007, the choice seemed an easy one, as it was already evaluated and was reported to strike the perfect balance between durability, comfort, flame resistance, and cost. And so this all birthed the FR ACU, or Flame-Resistant Army Combat Uniform, which was virtually identical minus a few minor things. Beyond the fabric now being that 65-25-10 material that sometimes has an odd effect of gaining a faint pinkish hue, that was also seen in a ripstop type weave, though never officially referred to as it on tags, it also saw the nylon zipper pull tab on the coat change to the same FR material. The belt loops continued to fall between the previously mentioned range, however they seem to be now made mostly on the narrow but longer side, and the addition of 2 small nylon squares sewn onto the wearer's left sleeve cuff and left thigh cargo pocket flap, which were used as a quick identifier to differ them from standard ACUs. These didn't begin to make their way to soldiers until the end of the decade. Many early garments featured contract numbers which date them as 2005 and share stock numbers with their standard counterparts, though by and large most of the ones floating around state right at the top they are Army Combat Uniform flame resistant. Assorted early ones didn't, instead either adding Type 2 at the end and or just saying at the very bottom that the garment was flame resistant. This was due to them sharing virtually the same spec sheet, with the FR variants only having the amended differences just mentioned. These, along with the combat shirts, began to make their way abroad in the second half of 2007 to those immediately at risk of burns. However, by 2008 they were being issued on a much more common and near universal basis. Now, you'd think that was the end of it, but no, as there was something of a legal problem. Though the Defender M fabric was produced in the state of Georgia, its Lenzing FR rayon fiber wasn't, instead being imported from Austria, which directly conflicted with the Berry Amendment that essentially stated any and all U.S. military goods must have their components produced within the country. To solve this, in 2007, the Department of Defense issued a DNAD, or Domestic Non-Availability Determination. This act pretty much stated that the material had no U.S. sources or equivalents, allowing for the exception. This was picked up by Congress not long after, which granted a temporary waiver lasting until 2013, as it would allow sufficient time to essentially domesticate the production or material. But again, it
wasn't that simple, as the topic became something of a debate point, leading to assorted politicians and textile companies weighing in. In 2009, an effort was made by Georgia Senator Johnny Saxon to make the waiver permanent, which was voted down in the Senate. The waiver was then extended until 2015, the following year, and in 2011 granted an indefinite status for the material to be imported, but instructed the DoD to continue assessing and searching for possible domestic alternatives. But that was just one hurdle the ACUs had to get over, as there were still a few others that were taking shape, most notably the uniform itself, which inevitably led to a few changes and tweaks after a brief field test. In 2008, the Army conducted field testing that lasted around 60 to 90 days at Fort Lewis, Bliss, and Carson, which saw 2 separate experimental ACUs that had a few new features such as different fabric compositions and weaves, slight changes to things like pen pockets and buttons versus hook and loop, as well as a few other alterations, which were done to try and remedy a few shortcomings of the ACUs. This was actually talked about in an older video which went over some experimental versions, linked to which you can find at the end of this one. Anyway, though some of the major changes weren't adopted, a few were, which helped to lead to the first generation ACU's second iteration, or to keep things on track with our naming, Generation 1 Variant B. Beginning to appear around the early 2010s, these changes could be considered nominal, but did help a bit in the long run in some regards. However, they didn't all come at once, leading to even more variations in uniforms. The changes really came down to 2 primary noticeable things: IR tab square placements and button versus hook and loop securing methods. The IR or glint square, once sewn onto the upper shoulder pocket flaps, were now on the nylon cover band, as it was determined over time it would be prone to scratching, lifting during washing, and if a patch was placed in the section, it would either sit weird over the cover flap or damage the square. And the 3 hook and loop rectangles on the front closure were shortened from 2 inches, or just over 5 centimeters, down to 1.5 inches, or about 3.8 centimeters. Initial versions of these tops were made with hook and loop sleeve cuff adjusters, as they had been, but would eventually be switched over to an inward-facing 3-hole adjustment method using BDU buttons. This new inward style, though a little trickier to use, didn't expose the buttons to potential snagging or damage. The whole button versus hook and loop thing was actually a point of contention for a little while with the FR ACUs, but we'll get to that in a little. As for the trousers, they too saw changes. The most useful and obvious was their thigh cargo pocket hook and loop securing method changed to 3 BDU buttons. A third was added along the inner edge of the pocket to allow for closing with more items inside them, while their securing flaps were extended just slightly to allow for the buttonhole securing portion. Oddly enough, not all of these changes were applied to the FR ACUs, as the trousers continued to be made with the longer and narrower belt loops, even though they had gained something of a tendency to wear down and break faster, while the coats kept their hook and loop cuffs. Supposedly, the reason behind this was that officials believed this method provided a better seal against flames or blasts that could funnel up the sleeve. But this was only seen with the UCP versions and not the OEF-CP ones, which only makes things stranger. Over in Afghanistan, the universal camouflage pattern was proving to be pretty ineffective, and in 2009, Congress passed a bill stating the DoD had to, quote, take immediate action to provide combat uniforms to personnel deployed to Afghanistan with a camouflage pattern that is suited to the environment of Afghanistan. Not long after, 2 patterns started being tested: UCP Delta, a color-shifted variant of the standard digital pattern with more earthen colors, and Multicam, officially licensed by Cry Precision. After a testing period, it was determined Multicam was the clear winner, leading to it being adopted as something of an interim pattern for troops there, with an eventual plan to settle on a different design that would become the standard branch-wide. But that's a whole different story. As for the ACUs, these 2 patterns were printed on. They were only made in FR ACUs bearing the same defender and material, as the idea was that these would be used really only during operations outside the wire, meaning beyond military bases, which in turn meant a higher chance of exposure to flames and/or explosives. Now, what's interesting is that while these were being made, the decision to remove hook and loop material from the trouser cargo pockets was approved, as sand and debris could clog them, they were loud, and would wear down, leading to them no longer working over time. As for the coats, though, they saw the same features as their UCP counterparts, with one version seeing hook and loop material remain for the cuffs, while others had buttons. It's hard to say the exact reasoning, as there appeared to be no FR ACU coats in UCP with buttons, at least on any notable scale. A good guess for this is that the FR ACUs in the OEF-CP pattern were technically classified as a different version when it came to NATO stock numbers, at least, meaning to switch over the UCP ones was deemed unnecessary, as around this time too an endeavor to update both the camouflage and uniform were in the early stages, but we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. Whatever the case though, this updated version between the standard and flame resistant added quite a few more iterations. However, we're not done yet, as while this was going on, another series of testings and modifications modifications were being conducted. And no, not related to the operational camouflage pattern, though it did slightly help as it greatly modified elements of the uniform. This wasn't an endeavor for safety or damage control, but for body contours and increased comfort. But before that, a quick detour talking about the ACU-P. Never heard of it? Well, that's because it was only called that on a semi-official basis. All it was insect-treated ACUs and FR ACUs. Starting to appear around 2009, though majorly in July of 2010, these came in pretty much all the variants talked about thus far, either when they were being made or retroactively applied, and were identified by the addition of another tag stating they were treated with insect repellents. Though older uniforms had seen insect repellent variants, which were often identified with a yellow tag, they were frequently much less common, and when the ACUs came along, soldiers were simply instructed to self-apply repellents. These new ACU-Ps, the P standing for permethrin, were good to go out of the gate for at least 50 washes and provided much higher protection rates. But now back to that other development and testing endeavor that was just mentioned. Since the introduction of the ACUs, they had pretty much been made in the same overall design, but with broad and general sizing that was mainly based around the male body, meaning that many women had to deal with baggy and often oddly fitting pieces. To address this, an endeavor had begun in 2008 with a focus group giving input about the issues, eventually leading to the creation of the first female-only combat uniform. However, quickly it was determined that it would be approved for any soldier if it meant a better fit overall. Known as the A-ACU or Alternate Army Combat Uniform, though also the ACU-A, it again took the general design that had already been established, plus many of the updates like the button cuffs, and altered a few elements before beginning issue to soldiers in 2013. Beginning with the coat, their front saw the chest rank location moved up slightly, lining up closer to the top of the chest pocket so that it was now positioned above the breast. The zipper now ran further down the front closure, the shoulders were narrowed while the sleeves were changed in both width and length, the pen pocket and reinforced elbow sections were moved to contour to the arms a bit better, and on the backside the bi-swing was taken in much more, allowing for the garment to overall fit better with smaller or more curvy chests, hips, and waists. As for the trousers, they too saw their reinforcement knee areas repositioned along with the thigh and lower leg cargo pockets. Proportions overall were adjusted to better conform to different hip to waist ratios, as well as front and back rises. The button fly was shortened, and perhaps most noticeably, the internal drawstring adjusters were removed and replaced with elastic portions on either side of the waist. They were made in 16 sizes, which didn't follow the standards seen up until that point, being small short, medium long, and so on, instead giving a specific number for the waist, then a size like extra short for the length. Though advertised as an alternative for the standard ACUs, these would more or less be spun off into the female ACU when OCP hit the scene. But again, as this was going on, more work was being conducted, which pretty much overhauled the ACU based on general feedback while also solving the camouflaging crisis that had been plaguing the Army. Yes, we're finally at OCP. Initiating roughly around the same time as the ACU development, the Army was deep in the process of testing and evaluating camouflages for their new general purpose permanent pattern. This saw the OEF-CP, aka multicam, being an option, along with an assortment of other submitted designs. Though this was a story in of itself, it essentially was one half of a larger endeavor to upgrade and update the ACU. Since close to its introduction, complaints and feedback had been received, often leading back to a handful of things, with the most notable being the Mandarin-style collars and excessive amounts of hook and loop material. Around 2011, early discussions arose of how the uniform cut itself was going to be reassessed, while also taking this feedback into consideration, as well as building upon some of the initial changes and upgrades they had received over the years. Between this and roughly the end of 2014, bits of information would begin to sprinkle out about the updated ACU bearing the new Scorpion W2, officially dubbed OCP or Operational Camouflage Pattern, which began being issued in small batches in the first half of 2015 to select forces participating in operations against the Islamic State, as well as that year's Operation Atlantic Resolve, which originally had begun in response to Russia's annexation of Crimea. During this time, two early mock-ups and informational graphics started to appear in anticipation of them becoming available to all for purchase, followed by the phase-in period, which was slated to begin July 1st, 2015, with standard issuing of them in initial clothing bags for new soldiers beginning in January of 2016. This small window did see some very slight last-minute alterations, but after July 1st, this new ACU in the OCP, as well as the OEF-CP and UCP ACUs, could all be worn, though not mixed together, as in a UCP cap, OEF-CP coat, and OCP trousers, until September 30th of 2018, which allowed for the easing of the financial burden of purchasing them for existing soldiers while also trying to exhaust as much of the old stock ACUs as possible. This wear-out date was eventually pushed back a full year until September of 2019, where OEF-CP and UCP would no longer be regulation and formally and finally retired. Now, this all sounds well and good, however, this transition period was something of a mess for a few reasons, and fully fledged documents and guides were published explaining what you could and couldn't do. Additionally, you'd think this period would see new and existing contracts focusing solely on the creation of the OCP in what was essentially the second generation ACU. Well, no, and this is where things get a little weird. Let's first start with a breakdown of the new version. After a few seconds of inspection, most can tell that these were updated and are noticeably different from the first generation, and though they bear the same name and officials stress this was the exact same uniform, they have enough change to justify classifying them as a new generation. Arguably the most common of these is the 50/50 nylon cotton ripstop version bearing the OCP pattern, which had their tops see the following changed. The collars were no longer Mandarin styled, instead being fold down. Zippers no longer went all the way up to the collar, allowing for easier folding down of them. Like the later versions of the first generations, they also included inward-facing button cuffs. The pen pocket was shortened from 3 slots to 2. The reinforced elbow areas remained, though the hook and loop secured opening for the addition of foam pads was eliminated, as the feature was overall rarely used and generally loathed by most. The shoulder pockets were completely redesigned, taking a lot of influence from the Army Combat shirt's left sleeve pocket, seeing them increase in length by 1 inch or about 2.5 centimeters, while eliminating the pocket flap hook and loop secured design for a vertical zipper located along the inward edge, which granted easier access to wearers, as well as a more uniform and simpler area to attach insignia and other patches. Finally, the IR tab was completely separate from the pocket, being moved above it, meaning it was located on its own, though still featured the nylon cover band. Moving down to the trousers, these saw less drastic changes, including the removal of the waist adjustment cord, as it was likely deemed redundant and unnecessary. Belt loop widths were adjusted to 0.625 of an inch with an allowable variance of 0.0625, or about 1.59 centimeters with a 0.159 variance, and a length of 2.125 plus or minus 0.125 of an inch, or in centimeters about 5.4 with a 0.32 variance, which generally narrowed the allowable range and improved their strength overall. The removal of the elastic and barrel adjusters in both thigh cargo pockets, while also carrying over the updated 3 BDU button securing method. The reinforced knee sections had the ability to slot foam padding in removed, much like the elbows, and finally the lower leg pockets being secured by a button 2 rather than the 3 pieces of hook and loop. Apparently these pockets had been considered for elimination, but were ultimately kept. Interestingly, early released photos and guides to outline these new ACUs appeared much closer to the Gen 1s. If you look close, you can see that the Mandarin style collar remained, as well as the zipper going all the way up, and the pen pocket still had 3 slots. The shoulder pockets were the only noticeable change, but even they were slightly different compared to the final versions, as they featured the IR tab in one of the corners, much like that of the combat shirts of the time. Judging from this, it appears the uniform cut saw changes over its short development period, with some possible last-minute adjustments being done before standardization. These changes effectively helped cut down on the hook and loop material, which was an annoyance to many, improved on a few already amended features, while also applying other successful ones from other garments. As for the second-gen FR ACUs, they featured the exact same thing across the board, minus 2 things. They continued to use the same nylon identification squares, and no longer had their zipper pulls being made of the same fabric, instead remaining the standard nylon material. Though not seen on every single tag, these coats and trousers were now officially designated as Army Combat Uniform Unisex, which pretty much meant the same thing. However, the addition of unisex was because the A-ACU had evolved into the Army Combat Uniform Female. When updated into the Gen 2 version, the female ACU sporting the OCP design was mostly the same, seeing a blend of the A-ACU with the Gen 2. The only real update these had was that the front zipper on the coat no longer went all the way down to the bottom, instead terminating roughly around the same distance ratio-wise as its predecessor and Gen 2 unisex version. On top of that, they also began being made in flame-resistant versions. But speaking of which, you may think, well, the versions of these 2 OCP ACUs boil down to just unisex and female, known officially as Style A and B, NYCO ripstop and flame-resistant, officially Type 1 and 2, though also 3, but no peaking on that yet, and treated or untreated with insect repellent, officially Class 1 and 2. And on paper, this was technically true, However, there was quite a bit more going on. It seems that during this transition period, in addition to using up existing stocks of already created first-gen ACUs in the OEF-CP and UCP patterns, they also decided to try and use up as much material too, as there are examples of these second-gen ACUs bearing both camouflages. Though talked about briefly in that rare and experimental ACU video mentioned earlier, the seemingly most common one was the 50/50 NYCO ripstop version in the UCP, with the coats often being seen. However, their trousers aren't nearly as encountered. After looking through dozens of websites and spending months keeping tabs on eBay listings, not a single one was found, so go figure. However, a much more seldom seen variation is one made in the 65-25-10 flame-resistant OEF-CP fabric, sporting contract dates of 2012, which sounds early, but considering contracts can often be awarded just for types of uniforms that can be updated afterwards, it makes sense. Interestingly, this version shares the same NSNs as the older button cuff first-gen FR ACUs in the same pattern. Now, with these two rare examples, it's hard to tell if this was a case of them simply trying to use up older camouflage fabric before they were officially retired, as assuming they became available during the general rollout or even slightly before, they would already have a built-in expiration date. If we look at the specification sheets for these, the standard uniforms were approved to be made in all three patterns, which again just seems odd. Factor in the possibility of FR UCP fabric being used, as well as all of the above being produced in the female ACU too, and it's entirely possible there's even more out there. But speaking of flame-resistant fabrics, let's now get back to those, as they're not that cut and dry, because as we've seen thus far, nothing ever is. Remember that whole congressional battle over the flame-resistant fabric and the indefinite waiver, but also the casual statement of, hey, by the way, if you can find a domestic alternative,
that would be great. Okay.
Well, it seems that it wasn't forgotten, as research on it continued and different compositions were experimented with and tested. Going back to the spec sheet and looking a little more carefully at it, there are technically three types. One is the standard NYCO ripstop, two is the tried and true 65-25-10, and type 3 is a generic-sounding flame-resistant FR cloth ripstop. Type 2 and 3 don't really see any difference, as they both are stated to adhere to the same standards as set out by the flame-resistant fabric specification sheet. The 65-25-10 blend, though, still seems to be the most common version. Others have been observed in Type A and B, sporting compositions that quite literally say just FR cloth ripstop, while others like this one from a Type B is 35% nylon, 35% cotton, and 30% aramid blend, with another being 37% aramid, 32% nylon, 29% cotton, and 2% anti-stat. Judging from this, it seems this third type was added as a catch-all for any and all FR fabrics that met the requirements, allowing for alternative domestic sources and compositions being utilized. When put next to one another, you really can't tell a difference, as they both look to have that slightly darker, almost faintly faded appearance, at least when compared to the Type 1 50/50 NYCO. But with that, you're probably thinking that we covered all the versions. But you'd be wrong, as there's actually a pretty new one to hit the scene, which technically isn't another type, but actually another class, aka one treated differently. Starting in the late 2010s and into the early 2020s, the US began to realize that new and improved infrared and specialized camera technologies could be utilized to spot forces on the ground much easier in certain settings and scenarios that once would not have been possible. With said technology becoming easier and more accessible, it was said best by a 2023 PEO soldier slide. No safe space, soldier and equipment is emitting and reflecting almost everywhere, and Army interest in reducing signature across entire spectrum. This in turn began a multi-year endeavor to find ways of applying agents to clothing to help mitigate these new potential threats of detection, with one coming in the form of SWIR, or shortwave infrared treated ACUs. Not bearing any physical differences, the only real way to differentiate these is by the tag inside, which simply has SWIR next to the fabric composition part. As of this video's release, these seem to still be in the process of making their way out, but likely over time they'll probably be seen more and more, with the possibility of other specialty treated variations appearing in the future. Now, thus far we've mainly been taking a look at standard and officially issued uniforms, which were seen on large scales, theater or branch wide, but there are a few others that don't quite fit into that category. Obviously, as mentioned before, there were some experimental ones like UCP Delta, which went up against multicam, not to mention the AB test pieces, which played around with fabrics and so on, and the Civ PU, which was essentially a tan-colored ACU trialed for civilian use. All of these have been talked about in other videos on the channel, so give them a watch if you're interested. But aside from those, and maybe a prototype one here and there, the biggest by far were OpFor or opposing forces. Somewhere in between issued and privately purchased, these were frequently given out on a case-by-case basis, and, like OpFor uniforms of the past, varied based on unit, location, rotation, and training scenario or operation. However, some of the more popular and common versions were solid colored ones like green and black. Like the standard ACUs, both first and second generations were observed and from accounts created by a variety of different companies, with some saying brands like Proper and TrueSpec, like this one here, which is technically Proper's TAC-U series that sees minor differences such as a lack of IR squares and strips on the coat, as well as a zipper and double snap button fly versus the standard BDU buttons on the trousers. This is hard to say for certain, as oftentimes commercial variants may have been made in military specifications, though not made in the United States, which would violate the Berry Amendment, though there are exceptions below certain thresholds, such as on certain unit or situational levels, allowing for COTS, or commercial off-the-shelf items being purchased, which these very well may have been. However, by and large, the most seen and encountered, at least for collectors, came with the Gen 2s, which again were primarily observed in green and blacks, though also on occasion camouflage such as Tiger Stripe. Specifically, Tiger Stripe products take on it, as denoted by their logo, seen occasionally throughout the design. These included just about all the same features, minus the IR tabs again, and were produced by Mosi and by SNC in two versions, 65% polyester and 35% cotton, and a 100% cotton ripstop. The tags inside lacked contract and NATO stock numbers, but were formatted a bit more officially, with some stating they were made in the United States, while others had an area for or were marked with lot numbers, all of which together more closely line them up with official military issue equivalents. This all, along with SNC stating that they have also sold commercially only OEF-CP and OCP ACUs, lends a bit more credence that they were likely to have been small-scale contracted pieces directly for opposing forces units rather than COTS garments.
Okay, so not that bad, right? Bet you didn't expect there to be so many versions of the ACU. Now, I'm sure some completionists out there are going to try and track down every single version. Definitely more power to you. For that though, you're absolutely going to want to scrutinize listings and items on websites, as oftentimes these features and details are ignored, overlooked, or not even considered. But as said at the start, Venture Surplus is a great starting point for many of these. Additionally, it's a bit hard to pin down every single iteration, as the Army combat uniform as a whole never really stopped being adjusted, upgraded, and revised. If you want to get technical, there are instances like trousers, which saw a retrofit after the fact that tweaked things like the seat of the pants and just added a small tag which could technically be seen as another variant. So that means there's likely a few more variations out there. But hopefully this breakdown, which covered some of the more common and large-scale versions, is a good starting point for anyone who's interested in seeing all of them compared and contrast, or was just interested in getting a collection going. If you enjoyed the video, why not give a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't quite gotten to it yet? If not, that's all good. Just be sure to come back soon for more videos right here on Uniform History. It's still cold in here, but yeah.